What is up, everybody? Welcome to the DFS MVP podcast. I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com with my co-host, Matt Savoca. Welcome to season 7 of the DFS MVP, episode 169. If you're new to the DFS MVP podcast, we are a strategy-based NFL DFS podcast, giving you our favorite picks every week on FanDuel and DraftKings. And on top of that, we go over a theory segment ranging from the macro to the micro, trying to make you a better DFS player, not just telling you who to play in DFS. This week, we're going to be discussing the concept of leverage in GPPs. Before we get into it today, make sure you're checking out all of our other shows. Matt and I do a cash review every Monday, 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time. That is here on YouTube. Every Saturday, Matt Harmon of Yahoo, him and I do a DFS Yahoo strategy podcast that comes out Saturday on the DFS MVP platform, as well as the Yahoo platform. DFS Last Look with Jordan Vanek, that is every Sunday morning, 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time. That is on our DFS subscriber-only Discord, so make sure you're getting signed up for the Discord for that. If you haven't signed up for the DFS subscription yet and you want to get into that Discord, go to 4for4.com, use the promo code DFS MVP for 10% off. The price is down to $74, so you get an extra 10% off that. And if you're listening to this, if you've already done your fantasy football homework for the week, why not do that homework and take all of the hard work to turn into real cash with PrizePicks? Simply pick 2 or more players, decide if they will go over or under their stat projection. This week, we're loving the over on Ricky Seals-Jones fantasy points, the over on James Robinson rushing yards. You can go to 4for4.com and check out all of our PrizePicks picks in the PrizePicks article. Download the PrizePicks app today or visit prizepicks.com. And if you deposit this week with promo code 4for4, that's the number 4, F-O-R, the number 4, you will get a $100 instant deposit bonus matched dollar for dollar. PrizePicks is hands down the most fun, fast, and easy way to play daily fantasy sports. Prizepicks.com. Play today. Matt, welcome to the chaotic week 6. We have a 10-game slate, and on the shortest slate of the year, we have a bunch of injuries. How's it going?
Good. I mean, yes, it's been a little chaotic for us, the content makers for DFS, but I actually think for DFS players, there's been a little bit more clarity than we're currently thinking about, because I know you and I have been swimming in edits of basically every single piece of content we've been doing all week this week.
Yeah,
I digress.
Yeah, this morning, as soon as we started putting out content, we just got hit with the wave. So we're going to cover those, and we'll talk about how those fit into our strategy. But we will go into it and go throughout our values and hopefully touch on guys that won't be impacted by the injury bug. So let's see who you got. Start at quarterbacks. Who you looking at this week? Hopefully not injured.
Yeah, hopefully not injured. And yes, there is an injury that is applicable to this player, but I really like Taylor Heinicke. And I know I'm not the only person in the industry talking about this Kansas City Chiefs Washington football team matchup. And for good reason here. We got the Kansas City Chiefs, who are in as close to a must-win situation as you can be in for a Week 6 team. But truly, in the AFC with so many stacked teams, I'm very concerned about a squad that starts 2 and 4. Yeah. So while I'm not super concerned about the Chiefs ultimately losing this game, their defense is certainly bad enough to be losing their team games. I mean, they're ranked bottom 5 in most main metrics for defenses that we're looking at right now. 31st in yards per pass attempt allowed, 32nd, that's dead last in points per play allowed, and 25th in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing offenses. I saw a great tweet this week that said Patrick Mahomes looks like a player who's trying to score 21 points on every single pass because he knows his defense is giving up 7 points when he comes off the field. And so it sets up this situation where we have condensed target shares on both sides of the ball. We have an offense in Kansas City we have very little concern, because certainly Washington's defense has underwhelmed this year. And so Washington is going to be forced into catch-up mode. That's what a lot of people are seeing. I think the shootout potential is really high, so long as my receiver value plays this week. And I'm hopeful, even though he was a DNP today on Friday.
Yeah, that can have a huge impact on the game. I mean, just from a standpoint of these two teams and how they've been performing, these two defenses specifically, every single team, like the implied totals over-unders for both of these teams have been high every week, and they're still scoring above it, still giving up points above that number. Every team has went over their implied point total against Kansas City by an average of over a touchdown. So, like, they're giving these teams high implied point totals for underdogs. We see Washington with an implied point total over 24. Teams still hitting the over by a lot. 4 of 5 teams have hit the over against Washington. If you combine the numbers, we've seen these two teams give up 81 total points over their opponent's implied point total. So it should, the shootout should be in full effect. I mean, even with some injury news today, I haven't seen the over under or the implied point totals move much. So hopefully things will still go off as planned in that game. I'm staying up in the expensive quarterback tier. Lamar Jackson, 8,200 on FanDuel, 7,400 on DraftKings. We have the Ravens favored by 2.5, projected for 27 points at home against the Chargers. And we know what Lamar does on the ground. He's giving us 9.2 fantasy points per game on the ground, but they're finally letting Lamar throw. They're middle in the pack of pass attempts. Like, they're never going to be at the top of the league in total pass attempts, but that's not what we need from Lamar. We just need him to, give us enough to, like, quote unquote, unleash him. Now, after last week's big game, he's averaging over 300 yards per game through the air, which if we get that from Lamar all season, I mean, that's QB1 all over it. He's given us if you're playing on DraftKings, a 300-yard bonus each of the last 2 weeks. As you noted in your article, he's the only quarterback that has a 3x projection on FanDuel. On DraftKings, he is his value score 50% higher than even the quarterback too. So he is our top value on both sides of quarterback by a big margin. And people might look at this Chargers defense and have some reservations about it. The one thing they're going to do, they're going to let teams run. Obviously, that's good for Lamar. And their raw numbers are really good, but from an efficiency standpoint, they're not that great. Quarterbacks are middle of the road in fantasy points per pass attempt allowed. They haven't faced a ton of pass attempts compared to some other teams. So I think Lamar can still have success on the ground and through the air here.
Oh, totally. I mean, it's so exciting. I don't want to overreact to just one game because I know the Colts secondary was beat up and PFF had that graded really badly already. Mm-hmm. But the narrative with Lamar Jackson is if you can force the Ravens to play from behind, force Lamar into pass first mode, he can't come back because they are such a rush heavy team. And that is exactly the narrative he overcame on Monday night. And what I'm noticing too is that the passing yards really, really showed up in that overtime game. But the air yards have shown that this type of passing potential has been there for a few weeks. 472 air yards in week 3, 424 air yards in week 4, and actually just 304 air yards in week 5. So he was more efficient in its passer air conversion ratio, but still the sky is the absolute limit. I don't know if we've adjusted to the QB1, the mega QB1 overall potential that he could have if he plays like he did on Monday night rest of season.
Yeah, and Pat James noted in his article on 4for4 that we kind of got a little bit of a primetime discount. Like if he has that game on Sunday, his salary is probably way higher than it is, but salaries came out before that big game on Monday night. So that helps us with a little bit of value. Moving on to running backs, we got some news early today that Nick Chubb is out. So, I mean, in theory, Kareem Hunt is the top overall value on the slate on both sides. He does have a questionable tag. So if you look at my content this week, I haven't put him in as a smash cash game play yet. I don't know how serious we have to take the questionable tag, but the way this week's going, if it's going to go the way of everybody else, I mean, it could be, who knows? I mean, a questionable tag is a questionable tag. So just keep that in mind that if we do get complete clearance on Kareem Hunt, he's the top value. But outside of him, who are you looking at this week?
Yeah, that's a perfect segue to my player because I know this is simplistic and this can get us burned sometimes because questionable tags can mean very different things, especially on Friday when we record it. Yeah, but just look at the number of questionable tags at the running back position, especially at the premium tier. It's dazzling. It's dizzying. It's not it's not
Not
good. We'll
dazzling.
say that. So the only person that I'm looking at who doesn't have one is Austin Eckler, who's been nothing but spectacular over the first 5 weeks of the season. This entire offense is performing at or above expectation, and Eckler currently leads all running backs in fantasy points over expectation. While he's a little bit of a better value on FanDuel than DraftKings, what I love about Eckler specifically is that he's not even on the field for something like 80-90% of snaps. He's only around I guess he's right around 80%, excuse me. But he's still not an every snap player. It's his receiving totals that make him so valuable. 5+ targets in 4 games after that week 1 where he didn't have any targets, had people panicking. I know he's number 1 in touchdowns, which can lead people to believing he's a regression candidate, but then look at the underlying usage. RB2 in slot snaps, RB7 in fantasy points per opportunity, RB7 in yards per touch. This is a player who's as elusive as ever and now is in the best offensive scheme of his career. I'm not going against him, especially in this expected high total game against the Ravens.
Yeah, the high end running backs, we already got an out designation on Christian McCaffrey, and it looks like Dalvin and Joe Mixon. Apparently, Dalvin's not on the injury report. Joe Mixon, the report is he's going to get his normal workload. I don't think they're slam dunks this week, just because we saw Joe Mixon be active last week and have he played 35% of snaps or something like that. And Dalvin, I guess you could play him in cash if you want. The matchup's not good against Carolina. Their run defense is number 1 and schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I still think when you combine the risk of re-injury, just because we've seen him try to come off field, play limited snaps, the Austin Eckler is really the only guy I'm paying up for at running back this week. There's a ton of running back value that I just don't think you have to do it with Henry and CMC off the slate. If you go a little bit further down in value or in salary, Jonathan Taylor's a guy that I'm looking at. 7,500 on FanDuel, 6,600 on DraftKings. He checks all of the boxes for us this week. They're 10-point favorites. Taylor is averaging 17.5 touches per game. He has a season high 4 targets last week. We saw him take that one screen pass to the house. What was that? 75 yards. So nice. if he keeps that up, his value only goes up, and he does have a ton of touchdown upside. Second most carries inside the 10-yard line, behind only Derrick Henry. He has 4 for 4s. Top 3 running back value on both sites. So that's where I'm looking there. There's a couple guys here that are really big favorites, but Jonathan Taylor just stands out to me because I think I could see he's kind of neck and neck with Darrell Henderson. I could see Jonathan Taylor's workload ascending just because he is so good, and they're not going to lean on Carson Wentz, so especially in these types of games. Whereas the Rams, they can decide they're just going to throw it 70% of the time, and Henderson's going to be fine. But I think I like to think that Taylor starts getting back to that 20+ touch range, and this could be the game for it.
I dig it too, and I'm noticing too that he was used more on 3rd down. Remember that big catch and run came on 3rd down where they typically used a spell back like Nyheim Hines. Nyheim Hines actually had 0 receptions in that game on Monday night. So I would love to see more of a snap share for Jonathan Taylor. If he starts to get something like a 65-75% opportunity share in this offense, right now it's only at 58. True RB1 potential with a little bit more in the receiving game.
And that's what we saw down the stretch last year. So I think this week can be the beginning of what we saw late in the year. Let's move on to receivers. One of the maybe the two most important injury designations are wide receivers in the Washington Kansas City game. And you like one of the guys from there if he's active. Who are you looking at? High-endish wide receiver.
How could you not like Terry McLaurin this week? Number 1 in our breakout receiver model, and only underperforming his expectation by a little bit, I should add. But the one scary part about McLaurin is that he didn't practice on Friday. And now we saw some diverging reports here. I saw NBC Sports Edge, formerly Roto World, talk about the Friday DNP being typically the most dreaded time to suddenly be a do not practice. And so I was initially very concerned. Then a senior writer for the Washington Post within the Athletic said that he was held out of practice out of an abundance of caution. That was direct quote from Ron Rivera. So I get a little bit more hopeful about McLaurin's status for Sunday. And truly, with the way that the Washington offense is injured right now, I get concerned about this shootout potential if McLaurin sits.
Yeah,
I mean,
me
he
too.
is the linchpin of this game hitting its over, in my opinion, because if the Washington offense has no McLaurin, they have no weapons, in my opinion. I mean, Antonio Gibson does look like he's going to play, but De'Ami Brown has been a question mark all season. Adam Humphries is really more of a slot target. He's not taking the top off of a defense. And Curtis Samuel is definitely out this week. So I just don't know what you're going to do. I guess DeAndre Carter's getting another 8 targets, maybe. But
he's going to turn that into another 45 yards.
Right. We're really, really hoping that McLaurin plays. And, he's the wide receiver 5 overall in target share, the wide receiver 4 in air yards. And you shouldn't be surprised then that at 4 for 4, he's our wide receiver 4 in projections, but he's the wide receiver 9 in salary on FanDuel. Yep. So I'm all over him as an easy value play. Please play Terry McLaurin.
Yeah, I mean, they said that the dreaded did not practice on Friday. A couple of blurbs down, they said, don't worry about Allen Robinson's did not practice on Friday because he usually plays through it. So take that with a grain of salt, I guess. If we usually don't do this, but we do have a obvious caveat with the did not practice on Friday. If he doesn't play, is there somebody else maybe it doesn't even have to be in a similar range, but just another receiver that you're really liking this week that isn't your second value?
Yeah, this is really just an excuse to talk about Ja'Marr Chase because, of course, as a stats guy, I'm always talking about regression candidates, and that's why we even have the breakout receiver model because of positive regression, and a 20.8% touchdown rate would usually scream regression. But we're doing things now like comparing Ja'Marr Chase's early rookie season to Randy Moss's early rookie season. Now, I'll remind people that Randy Moss went absolutely nuclear in November and December of his rookie year. So Ja'Marr Chase has a long way to go if he wants to have a season like that. But he's been nothing but impressive to begin his rookie season. And the thing I'm really liking is the increase in targets that we're seeing. Weeks 2 and 3, he had 4 and 5 targets. The last 2 weeks, he's had 9+ targets. That's really great to see. PFF has him graded as the number 2 overall wide receiver cornerback matchup, and Detroit's defense has been abysmal. Dead last in yards allowed per pass attempt and 29th in points per play allowed. Easy choice for Ja'Marr Chase. I know he's the most expensive, but he's absolutely my favorite of the 3 Bengals receivers.
Yeah, the thing that I loved was that we saw him with T. Higgins coming back last week. We saw him still get a 27% target share. He leads the league in fantasy points on targets of 15 or more air yards by like a huge margin, by like 25% or something like that. And Detroit's allowed the most completions on such targets. So Ja'Marr Chase in a really good spot this week. I'm going to go with a very good value play in a what should be a high scoring, which Sam Hoppin calls the best scoring environment for fantasy. I talked about Lamar on the other side, Keenan Allen at 7,400 on FanDuel, $6,400 on DraftKings. Basically, you're getting the same volume as Mike Williams at a really big discount. $900 discount to Williams on FanDuel, a $1,700 discount to Williams on DraftKings. And I know Keenan Allen obviously hasn't been scoring the touchdowns, not getting the deep balls that Williams is, that everybody's been talking about the Michael Thomas role as the X in this offense, which is fine, but Keenan Allen still leads the team in targets, still leads the team in red zone targets, tied for the team lead in targets inside the 10-yard line, well above average in weighted opportunity, well above average in targets per route run. So he's getting a huge target share in one of the best offenses in the league. It just hasn't been going nuclear like Mike Williams has, but Keenan Allen's going to have his spots where he does have the better game than Mike Williams. And now that we're seeing this huge gap in their salary, this is a week where I want to play Keenan Allen. When you're going to get the salary discount and the ownership discount, cash or GPP, I just love Keenan Allen this week, and this game sets up really well for both sides. So loving Keenan Allen there. Since we had an injury on your first guy, who's your third favorite value or third value play to discuss this week?
Yeah, you get a little bonus receiver here. I really like Michael Pittman, really, really sticking out as just a fundamentally missalaried player
Mhm.
right now, in that he looks like the true primary wide receiver that the Colts drafted him to be. And now I do kind of agree with you that, especially in a game against Houston, they may not lean on Carson Wentz's arm because they don't expect the Houston offense to do as much as the Baltimore offense would do against them. But still, I love seeing 6+ receptions in 4 straight contests
Yep.
for Michael Pittman. That's great. 9.8 targets per game over the last 4 weeks. That's nothing to scoff at. And 14th among all wideouts in total targets. So when you're talking about him playing a team in Houston that's bottom 10 in yards allowed per pass attempt and in points allowed per play, and they're also giving up above average adjusted fantasy points to
Mhm.
opposing offenses, it kind of screams all systems go. I'm not quite ready to debut it, but basically using a simple linear model of our value projections and salary. Basically, it looks like Pittman should be having a 7,200 salary, something like that, and it's down at 5,800 on FanDuel. So just really, really mispriced, underpriced right now, and so I'm going to take that value all day.
When are we going to get the debut of that model?
I don't know. I know I got to work on the data viz. We're getting there, but what I'm
All right.
trying to compare right now, just to go on a little tiny tangent, is as you would expect, as salary increases,
Mhm.
so too does value for the most part. And so what you really want is to look at that simple linear line and see the distance that players are both positive and negative. And if you just look at it on a simple graph like that, Pittman is a complete outlier,
Mhm.
sticking way ahead as just being simply missalaried this week.
Yeah, and even though I don't think they might not have to throw a ton because of game script, and they're probably not going to try to lean on Carson Wentz. When you have a player that's getting over a quarter of the targets, I mean that's kind of what you're looking for, right? He doesn't necessarily need a perfect game script to go off, especially on DraftKings where the volume of the catches are going to can make up for any game script concerns. He can get there in 3 quarters against the Texans in a game where Indy should score a lot of points, and they're projected to score a lot of points. So I'm actually going to stay in that game, and a guy that I also think his salary isn't as reflective of his usage, especially on DraftKings. Brandon Cooks, he's priced at 6,500 on FanDuel, down at 5,800 on DK, so pretty close to Michael Pittman on DK. Priced as wide receiver 17 on FanDuel, wide receiver 16 on FanDuel, so well outside the wide receiver 1 ranks, but he's seen opportunity that is pretty much only comparable to Devontae Adams. Second in weighted opportunity weighting to Devontae, top 5 in targets per route run. Basically, any usage metric you look at for Brandon Cooks, he's at or near the top of the league. Top 3 in target share, tops in air yard share. So this, on the other side, we talked about the script for Michael Pittman. This should definitely be a pass-heavy game script for the Texans. We actually saw them do pretty good in the passing game last week with Mills. And even if it doesn't go exactly as expected in terms of game script, this is a Colts defense that does funnel fantasy points to the passing game. They're 7th in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they're 31st against quarterbacks and 21st against wide receivers. So Brandon Cooks, I'm loving him this week. Any other wide receivers or wide receiver notes to make?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate the fact that Terry McLaurin is really the linchpin I have in my
Yeah.
notes for this shootout potential of the Washington game. I just don't see it being a shootout if he doesn't
Yeah,
play.
and we didn't even mention Tyreek Hill is like legit questionable too. So if both of them are out, I think one of the big questions, and this is probably getting more into like tournament speak, but like
Yeah.
what are we doing with this game? I would really pay attention to what happens with the game totals. If we see Tyreek and Terry McLaurin both out, I mean, the total will probably still stay above 50, but if it goes from like 54.5 to like 51, that's a pretty big move. And I think we might start talking about maybe fading the game or playing the Chiefs defense or something like that, because I think it will stay popular. I think Mecole Hardman's going to be probably the best value at wide receiver if Tyreek is out. But just lots of reasons to be in the 4for4 Discord this week. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, definitely a week where the articles are getting updated Saturday and Sunday. It's gonna be wild on our end, but we're gonna keep you updated all the way through to kickoff. That's for sure.
Yeah. I'll be around as much as possible, especially with that Sunday morning show. I'll kick it off with tight end because we're both gonna go high end here. Mark Andrews, I already talked about Lamar Jackson, already talked about Keenan Allen on a 10-game slate. Not surprising that we're really just going to be focusing on a couple of games in pretty much every format. I like Mark Andrews mostly because you're getting the big discount from Travis Kelce, $2,200 cheaper than Kelce on FanDuel, $1,800 cheaper than him on DK. We saw last week he has, going completely bonkers in his range of outcomes, which we shouldn't be surprised by. I think that this is a game that sets up for him to be the primary target for a lot of reasons. One, we have Sammy Watkins out, and a lot of people are thinking, oh, perfect. Well, Rashad Bateman's going to come in and he's going to just absorb that workload. I mean, this is a rookie that didn't play training camp, barely had any reps with Lamar because people forget Lamar missed some of training camp with COVID too. So they have barely any reps together, missed a lot of the early season. Rashad Bateman's great. He's a good receiver, great prospect. I think he's going to be great. I think if you have him in best ball, he'll probably get you some points down the stretch. I'm not ready to just jump on him his first week. And the Chargers, what we've seen, if we go back to other great offenses they play, we talked about the Chiefs a ton. What the Chargers do is they're going to limit the deep ball. They're going to let you run the ball and limit you to short passes. So we saw Travis Kelce have the good game against them while Tyreek Hill doesn't. I think it's probably a similar setup here where I'd rather have Mark Andrews against the way the Chargers play than have Marquise Brown. Mark Andrews is tied with Travis Kelce in expected fantasy points over the last 3 weeks. That's based on our receiver breakout model that you've already mentioned. And the Chargers 1 weak spot, which kind of ties into exactly what I just said about how they play defense, is a tight end, 23rd in schedule adjusted points to tight ends, which makes sense if they're just going to not let you throw deep. So when you do throw, you have to dink and dunk. Makes sense a tight end will benefit there. So it also makes sense that that's where they're allowing fantasy points. Who are you looking at? I kind of spoiled it for you, saying we both like the expensive tight ends, but with Tyreek not playing, who are you looking at?
Well, I think he may play. I heard that he looked, quote, his normal self on Friday. We'll see what that means come Sunday. But I actually wrote in my FanDuel cash game article that I'm planning on going no lower in salary than Mark Andrews. And honestly, I'm just kind of suggesting if you are looking to go way down in salary, just correlate it with your quarterback if you can. And speaking of a really good QB tight end correlation that works, but it's going to be a little bit more costly, is Travis Kelce. Same game environment. I just can't get away from it here. Kelce's salary is down on DraftKings almost inexplicably here. And our breakout receiver model, remember, it doesn't just include receivers, it includes tight end. And it's really, really exciting when you see a player as talented as Travis Kelce as a positive regression candidate in this high total game where Washington gives up the most schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing offenses. And in general, they give up more points to wide receivers and tight ends than they do to running backs. So everything sets up so well in this matchup for the number one offense in the NFL in expected points added per play. He's had 2 down weeks in terms of production, but still 16 targets over that span. I hate to just say the man is due, but I mean, Mahomes bounce back game, sort of must win game, positive game script. We favor tight ends on favorites anyway. There's just so many reasons to go up at tight end this week, and Travis Kelce is the best of the best.
Yeah, I like the note you just made at the beginning about if you're going to go down in salary, and I don't even think it's this week, but any week, fit in some correlation with your tight end because it's such a hard position to predict, especially in the environment right now where there's like we've seen over the last few years, we have these top 3 or 4 guys, and then just kind of it's awful. So why not instead of trying to guess who is going to pinpoint the tight end, it's really just kind of a tournament strategy but you can use it in any format at this position. Just correlate it with your what some kind of scenario with your defense, with your quarterback in a opposite of a pass catcher you already have in your lineup that locked into your lineup. Because then you have to be right less often, right? If that game script goes according to how you're hoping it goes, then hopefully that tight end benefits instead of just hoping like, oh, this guy, Mike Gesicki, that is saw 25% targets last week, maybe he'll do it again. So I think that's a really good note. I just wanted to mention this briefly because I do think it is interesting because we have the Terry McLaurin injury news we're waiting on. And I think Ricky Seals-Jones is just going to be popular anyway. We don't talk about tournaments a lot, but like if I could see, especially on DraftKings where you really people really punt tight end, I could see Ricky Seals-Jones like getting over 20% ownership. Any chance you're eating that kind of chalk in tournaments?
What? No, I don't eat chalk on
bad players.
He's not a bad player. Yeah, but like, you don't usually when a player who hasn't proven it is getting massive ownership because of expected game environment. That's not a situation I want to go to that player typically.
Yeah, I don't think it's good process in tournaments to take a player like Ricky Seals-Jones that could be in almost a quarter of lineups. That's going to see like you're hoping like for 7 targets and a touchdown. Like if you're really lucky, I mean, I guess you can make the argument if McLaurin is out.
We're not saying it can't happen.
No, but there's even data that backs up if you, the teams that have done well when they've went with chalky tight ends, it's typically been with the high end, high volume proven tight ends. Like I just think this is a really, really bad spot to eat the chalk. But we'll talk about that more in the Sunday morning GPP show. This is just a value show. So let's move on to the next position. Any value defenses stand out to you this week?
Well, really, it's the Indianapolis Colts. When you see this large of a favorite at home, you're probably thinking about that defense. And, I'm going to start off with the reasons that it could go wrong. They got a banged up secondary, and they weren't rated very highly as a secondary already going into Monday night's game, where they got more hurt. They were second worst in the NFL in PFF's coverage grade before Monday night, and now they're currently 29th. Houston quietly as well, the 9th highest in yards per pass attempt in the league through the first 5 weeks. So they haven't been completely inept, and that's what happens when you have multiple long touchdowns like they had last week against the Patriots. But I say all that, the Colts are still by far in our projections the highest value ranking, particularly on FanDuel. The Houston offense did have some signs of life, but they're still bottom 12 in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing defenses and bottom 10 in points per play as an offense. So I just think that when there is a lot of uncertainty, we're going to trust the Vegas odds makers to do their job very well. And we're just going to go with the fact that a 10.5 point favorite has a very high probability of just generating pressure, generating turnovers. A lot of things can go right for them that I want to try to get to them if I can.
Yep. And both sides have been pretty good about properly pricing defenses. We haven't had a lot of scenarios where favorites are even like in the bottom half of salary. So if you are going to pay up, you might as well go with the team that's favored by double digits. The one team that does kind of stand out as a defense that isn't priced as a favorite or kind of affordable is Minnesota. 3,700 on FanDuel, 2,900 on DraftKings. They're just a small favorite, but this is one of the best defensive line versus offensive line matchups of the week. Minnesota ranks 3rd in Football Outsiders adjusted sack rate, while Carolina is a bottom 10 offensive line in that same category. And the Panthers have an implied point total under 22. They have the 5th lowest implied point total on the slate. So even though it is only a 1-point favorite for Minnesota, you're just saving a lot of salary and really like the only favorite that you're going to see that low. So if you are liking them and you are a new FanDuel player, your day is about to get 20% better. Start playing fantasy this season with FanDuel, and we'll give you a 20% bonus on your first deposit up to $500 by going to fanduel.com/DFSMVP. This is a big time bonus. All you need to do to claim it is make your first deposit. They have some of the best contest structures in the industry. We've talked about it a lot. Those higher stakes GPP structures are great, really flat payouts for newer players. I really love their single entry contest. They have some of the best single entry contests, maybe the best single entry contest offerings around. Every week I'm tweeting out the exact structures that I like, so make sure you go to my Twitter for that. If you don't like the traditional formats, they have a bunch of different stuff besides just the main slate games. They have single games, they have best ball, they have snake draft. You can even play private contests with your friends. There's an awesome slate of games on hand this week, a bunch of tournaments, including the Sunday Million, which I cover every week, review, give you strategies on how to attack those large field tournaments. We've already talked about some of our favorite plays on FanDuel this week. You talked about Michael Pittman at 5,800. I like Brandon Cooks in the same game at 6,500. So experience season-long wins without the season-long waits. Sign up today at fanduel.com/DFSMVP to claim your bonus and start playing. That's fanduel.com/DFSMVP. Age and location restrictions apply. Bonus issued as a non-withdrawable site credit that expires after 30 days. Matt, let's get into our theory segment today. You suggested talking about the concept of leverage in GPPs. And then in Discord, we had a user that asked a question that was pretty much exactly that. His question was, should I be focusing on doing a group of leverage plays? For example, should he be taking the top owned players and finding leverage for all of those spots and then playing a group of them? Or should he just be looking to build leverage around stacks and secondary stacks? Basically, the question is, how much leverage should I be using? Should I be looking for leverage at every single spot? Just to answer that question shortly, I mean, we're endeavoring to be able to cover all of our bases in any scenario, whether it's player pool, whether it's getting leverage on the field. We're going to dig into the nuance of leverage, but do you want to quickly just talk about that specific question before we dig into leverage, like how much leverage you could get in a single week?
Yeah, well, I do think what tournaments you're playing, how many people you're playing against really matters in the context of this question. Now, first of all, I want to say that thinking in this manner is absolutely on the right track. Yeah. Is absolutely the way you want to go about thinking about leverage. And let's go into the exact definition of leverage, because I think it really matters here. In fact, I've seen some, dare I say, petty arguments about what leverage actually means in DFS, and we're certainly not going to settle any debates here. But we're not really talking about any sort of technical definition or statistical definition of leverage. We're really talking about the looser definition of it from good old Merriam-Webster. I've just copied and pasted it here. It's a positional advantage, the power to act effectively. And I think that works really well here. What you're talking about is specifying a process in this question above about how to find leverage, but I actually think it's a little bit more of an art than a science. Now, if you want to turn it into more of a science, I think you go to our GPP leverage scores at 4for4.com. That can literally help you define your exposures to players if you are playing mass multi-entry. In fact, that is a process I do even when I'm not playing MMEs, just to see how that is lining up. But to answer your question, really, it is different for every single player. When you play a Chiefs player and you have no Kelsey or no Hill in your lineup, that is a different amount of leverage if you're quantifying it than if you're simply playing a wide receiver against a chalky running back. So the numbers really matter here. What you really need to think about, the one overall overarching question that you need to think about is, what occurs when I'm right? What happens when the event that I chose is happening that others didn't happens? And if a lot of things do happen, a lot of things go well, that's when you have a huge day, those number one winning tournaments plays.
You mentioned people kind of get into the specifics of what leverage means. And I think probably what you're referring to is there's all type of things that we can do. And we're just being contrarian on what an actual leverage play is, what a pivot play is. not all of that is basically just semantics. Like, we really don't care what you're titling your article or what you're calling a good tournament play. The point is, when we're talking about leverage, we're basically talking about what can we do in tournaments that's going to be beneficial for us that the field isn't doing. So we're gaining leverage on the field, right? So we don't care about the semantics. You can let Twitter argue about that. What we care about is, are we figuring out a way to be better than the field? That's all. So whatever you want to call it, don't worry about that. Let people talk about that argument. And when you talk about the science of leverage, that is a discussion that is probably deserves its own theory segment on its own. And that's really getting into the nitty gritty of mass multi-entry. So when you get scientific with leverage, what we're talking about, you said exposure. So really what we're trying to do in those situations is get exact or as precise ownership projections as possible, and then decide how much exposure you want to a player, and creating very specific leverage based on a huge player, not a huge player pool, but a decent sized player pool with a lot of different lineups, up to 150, depending on the tournament you play. And an example is if the, and usually this comes down to chalk players. So if a player is going to be in 35% of lineups, do I want to be on par with the field and have that player in 35% of my lineups? Do I want to be overweight on the field, have that player in 70% of my lineups? Do I want to be underweight on the field and have that player in 10% or even 0% of my lineups? So that is a huge concept that requires a lot of practice, a lot of rules in a lineup generator, and a lot of strategy that goes way beyond player projection and just looking at a simple ownership projections. Some might argue that it doesn't even require much football knowledge. It just requires a lot of spreadsheets and ownership projections. But that's not what we're going to talk about here. We're just going to talk about the different types of leverage and how much you should be building this into your game, and just different ways to think about it. So let's get into it a little bit more. I mean, you said there's no way to answer just that question, but what are some ways that you're implementing leverage into your weekly process?
Yeah, and so I'm personally thinking about leverage from sort of a backwards standpoint, meaning what occurs most often. Yep. And then working backwards from that not occurring. So in that regard, I really, really like how that Discord user was talking. Discord user I need to win was talking about it, because that's exactly what he's talking about. He's identifying he's using the wisdom of the crowd to identify the most popular players, and then using his own knowledge of football to go against the grain of that. And really, if I could just try to define it, your goal here, it's do something, we'll call that thing X, do something X that has a realistic probability of happening, that directly negatively affects others who did something else that assumed your thing X wouldn't happen. And in those situations, you can actually find leverage all over the place. In situations where players are even just mildly popular, playing the player who has a similar projection, but half of the ownership is technically leverage. But to go back to the example I used before, it's most effective. And honestly, this is what most shows like this spend their time talking about, is it's most effective when you go against the grain of an extremely popular player. Now, I want to add one thing here. Personally, I actually do this backwards. I build a bunch of lineups first and then try to retroactively explain the leverage built into the lineups or not. And that's how I define it for myself. That is much more art than science. That's why I personally want to balance that out using the strategy hub, using the GPP leverage scores, because I think they both have value here. And last thing I'll say is, the more people you're playing against, the more leverage you're going to have. You're going to have to play a little bit of chalk, but way more contrarian plays the more people you play against. And so simply put, you need higher leverage options in those tournaments.
So when you're thinking about how you're going to fit leverage into your lineups for the week, like you said, you're not necessarily starting there, you're building a bunch of lineups. I mean, are you typically starting with a player pool that might have leverage scenarios? Like, for example, if there is like a Devontae Adams and a and a Aaron Rodgers stack that's going to be very popular, or like this week, a Patrick Mahomes and his pass catcher stacks that are going to be optimal. Are you building lineups with their pivots or leverage plays in there, or are you building first and then seeing like now a Aaron Jones fits into my lineups where I had Alvin Kamara? How are you kind of approaching that as far as your player pool goes?
Yeah, so I actually do it both forward and backwards. I'll build optimal lineups and then go from those optimals and pivot just to the contrarian plays. I'll use Jordan Vanek's article and pivot there. Or I'll create very specific rules or lock in very specific players and then generate a bunch of lineups off of them and just see which of those lineups built in the leverage, quote unquote, correctly for me. And I do think that if there was an exact formula for is this enough leverage for this tournament, we would simply give it to you and DFS would be a whole lot easier. But the bottom line is the reason it's leverage is because it has less of a probability of happening than the most likely thing. It just doesn't have a 0% probability of happening. So when it does occur and it affects, again, negatively affects the things that were more popular, that's when we get big wins. So ultimately, I do think it is something that you just learn over time to see. And on a slate like this, especially, it can change on Sunday morning what the actual leverage is when the chalk keeps changing up until kickoff.
I think maybe we can get into a couple more specific examples about how we use it, how much we can use it in a week. If we just go through what I think are the most popular leverage scenarios for people that aren't familiar with the term or might not be apparent what every single leverage option is. I think these are the three most popular ones. So I think the three most popular leverage scenarios are just simple leverage off a teammate. I think this is the most obvious one. It's basically is if a passing game is popular, you can get leverage by using the other passing game, by other players in the passing game, or by using the rushing game and vice versa. If Aaron Jones is going to be popular and Devontae Adams isn't, you get leverage by using Devontae Adams. To me, that's the very obvious leverage scenario. You get leverage within the same game, look for the most popular plays, the most popular positions, and then do something different. If a running back is popular, use the opposing defense's leverage. Those are the scenarios that I think are the most obvious ones. Another spot where you can gain leverage is just by using contrarian stacks, right? So this isn't necessarily leveraging off direct ownership, but looking at something like the Chargers and the Browns game last week. It was a game that just wasn't super popular, and it went off, and people that had that that stacked that game climbed up leaderboards really quickly. So you're not gaining leverage necessarily like off of a specific salary or off a specific ownership, but just that team or those players aren't popular. So you're going to be grouping contrarian players together and just lapping the field when it hits. And then using salary for leverage scenarios. So an easy one is just simple price pivots. If you have a chalky player at $7,000, look at another player at the same salary, good position, way lower ownership. That's just a simple price pivot. You're still getting leverage because anybody with a similar build probably has that popular player. You're going to lap them with the less popular player, or using salary just to flip a build on its head. If everybody's paying up for wide receiver and quarterback, you pay up for running back. If everybody's using a studs and duds approach, you using a balanced build. That's going to give you leverage because even if you have popular players, you have them fit in a different way than everybody else. So then you could be different. So it's obviously going to be impossible to use all of these scenarios together. So what is looking at that list of things, let's just start with the stacking. Are you typically starting with contrarian stacks, popular stacks, or are you even starting with stacks at all?
Yeah, I am. I actually should have mentioned that when I do the build a bunch of lineups process of my week, I am building very specific rules, including secondary game stacks. So I'm building quarterback stacks and secondary game stacks with very, very specific, usually rushing quarterback exceptions to that, but that's really the only thing. So I'm building in the correlations we all know about into those lineups first and foremost, and then just simply looking at some metrics like combined ownership and things like that to get a sense of where they belong. Are they super contrarian or not? Then I'm going to the player selection process.
Mhm.
And we're talking about leverage in this situation. Now, my personal favorite that you just mentioned is actually the game specific leverage, is
Yeah.
finding games with players who you can actually project for pretty high totals, but because of the game environment not being as popular as another game on that slate, that's where you really can see situations where you didn't have to think that much outside the box because all the players in that game hit together. And so just talking about Sam Hoppen picking out his favorite game environments for the week, that's going to be so helpful there. Personally, I think that's the best way to play it because it gets you out of the idea of projections. Projections help us figure out a decent lineup, but we don't get to first place with projections only. We have to nail something that the rest of the field doesn't. And in my opinion, the easiest one is just say, okay, this 46-point total instead of that 50-point total.
Yeah.
Let's just build around those popular players or
Yeah.
those less popular players.
And I think that is, like you said, that's the easiest way to be good at tournaments. And when I say easy, like you're not just going to do this and you're going to start winning the millie, but it's going to lead to less hair pulling, so to speak. If you start with Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, and Terry McLaurin, it's going to be you're going to be looking at the rest of your lineup and thinking, how do I need this running back defense contrarian combo? Do I need a random one-off? And now you're looking for all these random 5% players, trying to build all these other mini correlations. But I think when you're starting with the contrarian lineup build, all of a sudden, or contrarian stacks, I'm sorry, all of a sudden, all of your other plays become really easy because your primary build is starting from a place of being different. So half of your lineup, if you're going with a full game stack, say a quarterback double stack with a bring back, half your lineup is already contrarian. So now you can just fit it, whether they're values, high owned plays or not. You don't even have to think about it. What are the best plays that fit into that salary build? And then you don't have to, I just don't think you have to put as much thought into these nuanced plays. But the way
let me add one more wrinkle to that as well. If you're playing in a tournament where it is lower entries, like single entry or 3 entry, you can actually add players. If you're doing this game leverage play, and you can actually add more players, you can have a larger stack in those types of tournaments, especially if you're being contrarian. Well, I remember, I believe it was week 2 when the Falcons were playing the Buccaneers. I had a single entry lineup that had 2 Buccaneers wide receivers, Tom Brady and Gronkowski, understanding that likely what was going to happen is one of those 3 wide receivers or tight ends was not going to hit. But ultimately, they all hit, and there was other problems with that lineup. But you can make those decisions when it's a single entry, a three entry tournament, because you can get one thing wrong and still get to the top of those tournaments.
Yeah, and the reason that happens in single entry 3 max, especially smaller field, like let's say under 1,000 people, if it's going to take 250 points to win something like the Millionaire, in those smaller tournaments, it might take 210 points, 200 points. So basically, instead of needing a 99.9th percentile score, you might just need a 94th, 93rd percentile score. So basically, you have to get less things right. You don't have to be perfect. So if you could get that game environment right, and you know the fourth player in your game stack doesn't go off for 25, but they get you 16, then you can really start climbing up the leaderboards. The thing that I think I do, and I do typically like to start with contrarian stacks when I can, but when I'm looking at the slate, I'm looking at, first of all, I'm trying to figure out what is going to be most popular, because it isn't just always the team that's most popular. We've seen it in the last few weeks until this week. We haven't had a lot of players with like 40, or any players really with 40% ownership, even over 30% ownership. So in those scenarios, you kind of have to think, well, if I'm not going to have some uber popular offense or crazy owned player like above 40%, what's going to be the most popular thing? The easiest thing is contrarian game stacks. And then what is the obvious, quote unquote, obvious build? And we see this a ton on DraftKings. If you get 2 or 3 pump plays, you can really kind of decipher what the field's going to do in terms of how they're going to build, usually some kind of barbell approach. everyone's paying it up at running back, punting this tight end, Ricky Seals-Jones or something, and then they're just kind of fitting in their wide receivers. Just flip that on its head. That's one of my favorite ways to build leverage. But it really just depends on what you think is going to be overwhelming the field that week. And the thing I talked about in week 1, if you're trying to figure out, like, instead of looking at a slate and saying, where do I need to get leverage? Should I be looking at a mini stack? Should I be looking at a contrarian stack, price pivots? I talked about this in one of the GPP review articles. Look for the spots that are going to give you the most leverage, because we could find 15 leverage spots every week, right? So instead of saying, oh, I have this running back that's going to give me this leverage off this receiver, give me a running back that's going to give me leverage off the passing game on the other side, a running back that is going to be a price pivot off of another popular player, or even give me 2 running backs that are going to be able to do both of those things, but also flip the field. Maybe nobody's pairing 2 expensive running backs together, so you get price pivot off of a popular running back, and now you're playing 2 expensive running backs together when nobody else is doing that. So I'm looking for the spots that kind of check as many leverage boxes as possible, and then I can really start narrowing down, instead of thinking about my player pool, narrowing down my leverage spots. So looking at the most leverage possible.
And that calculating the most leverage is something that an optimizer and most tools right now really can't calculate, because if you think about it, it has to do a ton of background calculations in order to really understand the type of leverage based on all the people not in that lineup. It would be a ton to do. You could see sort of a next gen optimizer, and then something like the correlations tool that we have 4for4 eventually building in the ability to do something like that. But right now, that is something that you need to do yourself. And it is obvious in these situations, like this week, it's all about this Washington-Kansas City game, where it's very easy to just get contrarian, and then if that thing goes right, you have significant leverage. But calculating it, that's a really different story. So I just want to shout out to I Need to Win again, because he actually has a set of heuristics. He's looking at this top tier, and he's going through certain players. Now, the amount of people, like you said, play at least 3, that changes based on what type of contest you're playing. But this is exactly what we're talking about. You're going to have to figure out your own way. Yeah,
and the beautiful thing is, even if a lineup generator or a tool spits something out that shows you a player that is a leverage play, a price pivot, and like flips a build, there's still going to be a human element. People are still going to look at the player that comes out, and there's a reason that player is a sub 5% play, right? They're going to be like, it gave me Allen Robinson. There's no way that's right. I'm not playing Allen Robinson this week. Just check out my mentions from last night if you don't believe me. So let's look at let's just go over some quick, since we kind of covered like all these different leverage scenarios and how we're talking about them. Let's just give a quick example or two. What do you think the best leverage spots of week 6 are?
Just fading Kansas City, Washington, just assuming it totally bombs as a play, or just playing an onslaught, maybe the Chiefs onslaught. That would be solid leverage. I think it would just be downright contrarian to just play no Chiefs at all in this spot. But I think in general, game stacking around something other than Washington and Kansas City, and honestly, other than Los Angeles and Baltimore, is probably going to be solid leverage this week in general.
Yeah, this is a really good week. I think last week was a good week, and I wasn't on the Chargers Browns, but even though I wasn't on that, I said it was a good week to go contrarian in terms of games, just because we didn't have a lot of crazy high scoring games. This week, I think it's another good week to go contrarian in games, because we don't have 13 games. We only have 10. So we basically only need 2 games to not go to the expected scenario. And it's really good. I think the most obvious leverage is that spot as well. I think a really good way to get leverage on the field, if that game goes awry, is Darrell Williams with the Chiefs defense. If he gets early touchdown variance and the defense scores a touchdown, or the Chiefs decide, hey, we don't suck. Stop talking about that. We're just going to blow the doors off these dudes. And the Chiefs are in this crazy good scenario. Their defense, even though their defense isn't good, which is why we saw Cowboys get relatively low ownership. They get a late touchdown because they're up big last week. If you have Cowboys defense, you're dancing. So I like that spot again this week with the big favorite. And talked about the running backs. No CMC on the slate already. I don't think a lot of people are going to be on Dalvin. Everybody's going to be playing this middle running back tier in tournaments. I think a really good way to flip the build this week, and cheap running backs because of guys like Darrell Williams, Khalil Herbert. I can't think of another one, but there's a lot of cheap running backs available this week. If you play expensive running backs this week, like Dalvin, I think that's going to be Dalvin and Joe Mixon. That's going to be a really good way to flip builds this week too. Any last thoughts before we get out of here?
We're underrating the Cowboys this week. The Patriots defense is not that great.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Just saw the Houston offense score multiple long touchdowns in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed. They're just right at average, and I just think all the Cowboys have done this year offensively is impress. They could absolutely smack the Patriots, and
I like that.
Lamb and Cooper could go off. Honestly, I love that stack.
I love that call. Thank you for watching. If you're here on YouTube, make sure you are checking out our podcast. Subscribe to that, please. That helps a ton. A lot of our shows go on there. If you're listening on audio, go to YouTube and check it out there. Please rate and review. If you are on iTunes, that helps a ton. If you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe to the 4for4 YouTube channel. Reminder that the DFS subscription did drop down to $74 from $99 this month. So make sure you're using the code DFS MVP to get 10% off. If you're looking for another way to get our DFS subscription, head on over to 4for4.com/PrizePicks. You could get one for as low as $20 for new PrizePick users. Reminder about our other shows: Cash Game Review on Monday here on YouTube, 11 a.m. Pacific Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Every Saturday, Yahoo Values with Matt Harmon from Yahoo on the DFS MVP feed and the Yahoo feed. DFS GPP Last Look with Jordan Vanek, Sunday, 8 a.m. Pacific Time, 11 a.m. Eastern Time on the subscriber-only Discord. You can subscribe to the Discord right below this if you're on YouTube. Check the description. Follow us on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4 Football. Matt's at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys on Monday.